Don't touch him. The words cut through the room before I even realized what was happening. And suddenly, every conversation within a 10-foot radius died. Glasses hovering midair, laughter snapping off like someone flipped a switch, and I stood there, frozen, with a coworker's hand still awkwardly lingering near my arm like he didn't know whether to pull back or pretend this wasn't happening. But it was happening, because Alexander Cross, my CEO, 6'2" of controlled silence and perfectly tailored authority, was right behind me, his presence hitting like a drop in temperature, like stepping into shadow after standing in the sun too long. And then his hand closed around my wrist, firm but not rough, just certain, like this was exactly where it was supposed to be, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, which made no sense, none, because I was nobody. Just Ethan Blake from accounting, who still microwaved leftover pasta in the break room and prayed no one noticed, except now everyone was noticing. Everyone was staring, and I could feel it crawling up my neck, heat and panic tangling together as I tried to laugh it off, tried to step back, but his grip didn't loosen, not even a fraction, and when he leaned in, close enough that his voice brushed the edge of my ear, low and steady, it sent something sharp and electric down my spine. Stay close. Stay close. My brain tripped over the words like they didn't belong in my world, like they belonged somewhere else, somewhere with people who knew how to stand under chandeliers and not feel like imposters, somewhere that wasn't 12 hours ago when I was still invisible, still safe in that invisibility, before the gala, before the cameras, before everything tilted sideways and he walked straight toward me like he'd already made a decision I wasn't part of, before his hand found my jaw and his mouth pressed to mine in front of 100 flashing lenses. A kiss that wasn't rushed or sloppy or accidental, but deliberate, controlled, like a statement I didn't understand, and I remember the sound more than anything. The collective inhale, the click of cameras, the sudden shift of a room rewriting its story in real time. And afterward, when I finally found my voice, when I asked him what the hell that was, he'd only said, "Play along." Like it was simple, like it was temporary, like it was fake. And I believed him. I had to, because the alternative made my chest feel too tight, too loud. And yet now his hand slid from my wrist to the small of my back, guiding me forward through the crowd, steady pressure, subtle but impossible to ignore. And every time someone got too close, he adjusted, just slightly, repositioning me at his side, not behind, not ahead, beside, like I belonged there, like I fit into the space next to him as naturally as his shadow. And I couldn't tell if it was part of the act or something else entirely, something quieter and more dangerous, because when I finally gathered enough courage to speak, my voice came out thinner than I wanted. "Mr. Cross, you don't have to keep doing this." And for a second, he didn't respond, didn't even look at me, just kept walking until we reached the edge of the room where the noise dipped low, and then he stopped, turned, and those sharp, unreadable eyes locked onto mine in a way that made everything else blur out, like the rest of the world lost focus, and his thumb pressed lightly against my side, grounding, deliberate, and he said, softer this time but somehow heavier, "I'm not doing it for them." And my heart stuttered hard enough that I felt it in my throat. "Then why?" I asked, even though part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer. And for the smallest moment, something shifted in his expression, something almost human, almost unguarded, before it vanished, replaced by that same controlled calm as his gaze dipped briefly to my lips and back up again. And then he said, "Because I don't like anyone else touching what's mine." My brain stalled on that word, mine, like it did not belong anywhere near me, like it was too heavy, too sharp, and I could feel it echoing in my chest long after he said it. But before I could even form a response, before I could decide whether to laugh it off or push back, he stepped away just enough to put space between us again. Not much, just a few inches, but it felt deliberate, like he was giving me room to breathe while still making sure I stayed exactly where he wanted me. And then he turned slightly, already shifting back into that untouchable CEO persona, as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just said something that rewired my entire sense of reality. And people started moving again, conversations picking back up in cautious waves, but the energy had changed. It always changed around him, and now it was changing around us, and I could feel the looks, the curiosity, the quiet judgment, and my heart was still racing, too fast, too loud, like it was trying to keep up with something I did not understand. So I did the only thing I could think of. I followed him, because apparently that was what I did now. Stay close, stay where he could reach me. And it was not until we reached the quieter hallway near the conference rooms that I finally found my voice again. You cannot just say things like that, I said, softer than I intended, but it still sounded too loud in the silence. And he paused, not turning around right away, just enough of a hesitation that made my stomach twist, and then he glanced over his shoulder, expression calm, almost unreadable. Like what? He asked, like he genuinely did not know. And that made something in me snap, just a little, not anger exactly, but something close to it, something that pushed past the fear. Like I belong to you, I said. And there it was, out in the open, impossible to take back, and for a second I thought he would dismiss it, brush it off, tell me it was part of the act. But instead he stepped closer again, slow, measured, closing that small gap we had just created, and I could feel the shift before he even spoke, that subtle tightening of space, the way the air seemed to hold still. And when he looked at me this time, it was different, not colder, not softer, just more focused. Like I was the only thing in front of him that mattered, and it made my throat go dry. You think I would say something like that without meaning it, he said quietly, and I blinked, thrown off balance again, because that was not the answer I expected, not at all. This was supposed to be temporary. I managed, clinging to the one thing that still made sense. The kiss, the rumors, all of it. And he studied me for a moment, like he was deciding something, like he was weighing how much to say. And then his hand lifted, not quite touching, just hovering near my sleeve this time, close enough that I could feel the warmth without the contact. And somehow that was worse. It started that way, he admitted, and my chest tightened, relief and something sharper, tangling together, started. I repeated, because that word mattered. It changed everything. And his gaze did not waver. But I do not continue things I do not want, he said, simple, direct, and it landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because there was no room to hide in that statement, no easy way to pretend this was all strategy, all performance. And suddenly I was very aware of how close he was again, how easy it would be for him to close that last inch of distance, how easy it would be for me to let him. And that thought alone made my pulse spike, confusion twisting tighter with something I did not want to name. You are making this complicated, I said, because it felt safer to frame it that way, safer than admitting I did not know how to stand in front of him without losing my balance. And for the first time, something like a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief, almost invisible, but enough to shift the tension into something warmer, something more dangerous. No, he said, voice lower now, steadier. I am making it clear. And then, like he had decided that was enough for now, he stepped back again, just enough to break that charged space, and turned toward the conference room door, already moving on, already expecting me to follow. And I stood there for a second longer, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself I still understood the rules. Except I did not anymore, because somewhere between that kiss and this moment, the line between real and fake had started to blur, and I had no idea which side I was standing on. The conference room door closed behind us with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like it sealed something in place, and I stood there for half a second too long, trying to steady the way my thoughts kept slipping. But Alexander did not hesitate. He moved to the head of the table like this was just another meeting, just another normal moment in his perfectly controlled world, and somehow that made it worse, because nothing about this felt normal anymore. Not the way my pulse refused to slow down, not the way his words kept replaying in my head, clear, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I do not continue things I do not want, and I forced myself to sit, to open my tablet, to pretend I knew what I was doing while a few other executives filtered in, their conversations quiet at first, cautious, like they were testing the air, and then the glances started, subtle at first, then less so, quick looks in my direction, then at him, then back at me, and I felt it all, every second of it. The curiosity, the speculation, the silent questions no one was brave enough to ask out loud, and I focused on the screen in front of me, numbers, projections, anything that grounded me in something real, something that did not involve the CEO of the company acting like I belonged at his side. And for a moment it almost worked, until a voice across the table broke through. Casual, Too casual. So, Ethan, one of the senior managers said, leaning back in his chair with a faint smirk that did not quite reach his eyes. You have been getting a lot of attention lately. And there it was, not direct, not explicit, but close enough. And a few people shifted, interest sharpening, waiting, and I felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to downplay, to laugh it off before it turned into something bigger. It is nothing, I said quickly, keeping my tone light, steady. Just a misunderstanding at the event. And for a second, silence, the kind that stretched just a little too long. And then a quiet sound beside me. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to pull every eye in the room. The faint tap of Alexander setting his pen down on the table, precise, controlled. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, even, but it carried in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It is not a misunderstanding, he said, and my heart dropped, because of course he would not let it go. Of course he would not leave it where I tried to put it. And I turned toward him before I could stop myself, a silent question in my eyes that I knew he would see. And he did, his gaze meeting mine for half a second, steady, unwavering, before he looked back at the rest of the room. If there are questions, he continued, tone unchanged, you may direct them to me. And that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement that somehow shut everything down more effectively than any denial could have. And the room shifted again, tension easing but not disappearing, because now it was something else entirely, not confusion, not speculation, but something closer to certainty. And I sat there, trying to process what he had just done, because he did not have to say that. He did not have to take control of the narrative like that. He could have let me explain it away, let it fade, but he did not. And as the meeting moved on, voices blending into background noise, slides changing on the screen, I could not focus, not really, because every time I glanced up, even for a second, I caught it. The way his attention tracked me without being obvious. The way he seemed aware of where I was, what I was doing, without ever making a show of it. Subtle, controlled, constant, and it made something tighten in my chest again. Not fear exactly, not anymore, but something more complicated. Something that made it harder to breathe evenly. And by the time the meeting ended, by the time chairs scraped back and people started gathering their things, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. This was not just an act. Not in the way I told myself it was. Not in the way it was supposed to be, because acts had boundaries. They had limits. They stayed contained. And this did not feel contained at all. This felt like something expanding, something taking shape in ways I was not prepared for. And when I stood to leave, hoping for a moment to myself, just a few minutes to think, to reset, his voice stopped me before I reached the door, quiet, but enough. Ethan. And I turned, because of course I did, because I always did now, and he was already watching me. That same steady focus, like everything else in the room had faded again, and he said, you are leaving with me. Not a question, not even a request, just a decision, already made. And I felt that same sharp twist in my chest as I nodded, because I knew, somehow, this conversation was not over, not even close. The elevator door slid shut with a soft chime that felt far too final, sealing us inside a space that suddenly felt too small, too quiet. And I stood near the panel like I could somehow anchor myself there, fingers hovering over the buttons, even though he had already pressed the one for the private floor, because of course he had. And for a few seconds neither of us spoke, just the low hum of movement as the elevator started its ascent, steady, controlled, just like him. And I told myself to breathe, to get a grip, to remember that this was still supposed to be temporary, still supposed to be something I could step away from. Except the memory of the meeting lingered, the way he shut everything down without hesitation, the way he made it clear without actually explaining anything. And it twisted something inside me that I could not ignore anymore. So before I could lose my nerve, I said it. You cannot keep doing that. My voice quieter than I wanted, but steady enough, and his reflection shifted slightly in the polished metal wall across from me, his gaze lifting to meet mine through it. Indirect, but no less intense. Doing what? He asked, calm as ever, and I exhaled slowly, trying to organize the chaos in my head into something that made sense. Answering for me, I said, turning just enough to face him properly, speaking like that in front of everyone, like it is real. And the second the words left my mouth, I felt it again, That shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like I had stepped into something deeper without realizing it. And he watched me for a moment, not interrupting, not dismissing, just listening in that way that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. And then he took a step closer, not rushed, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance until I could feel his presence more than see it. And my pulse picked up again despite myself. "You are concerned about appearances," he said, voice low, even, and I shook my head almost immediately. "I am concerned about reality," I corrected, because that was the problem. That was the part one could not hold on to anymore. The difference between what this was supposed to be and what it was turning into. And for a second something flickered in his expression, something sharper, more focused, like that. Distinction mattered more than I realized. "And what do you believe this is?" he asked, and the question landed harder than it should have, because I did not have a clear answer. Not anymore. Not after everything that had happened in less than a day. And I swallowed, trying to steady myself. "It started as a solution," I said carefully, repeating his own words back to him in a way that felt safer, more controlled. "To protect your reputation, to control the narrative." And he did not look away, did not deny it, just watched me like he was waiting to see if I would stop there. And I did not, because I could not. Not with the way my chest felt too tight, too full of questions I could not ignore. "But now you are acting like it is something else," I added, quieter this time, because saying it out loud made it feel more real, more unavoidable. And the elevator slowed slightly. The faint shift in motion signaling we were close to the top, but neither of us moved. Neither of us broke that space. And then his hand lifted again, slow, deliberate, not grabbing, not forcing, just brushing lightly against my sleeve before settling at my wrist. The same place as before, but this time the contact felt different, less like a claim and more like a decision, something chosen rather than imposed. And his voice dropped just enough that it felt like it belonged only to this moment. "It is something else," he said, simple, direct. And my breath caught, because there was no hesitation in it. No room for doubt. And I shook my head slightly, because that answer only made everything more complicated. "You cannot just decide that on your own," I said, because I needed that line, needed something to hold on to. And for the first time there was a pause in his response, not uncertainty, but consideration, like he was measuring how much truth to give me, how far to push. And then the elevator door slid open with a soft chime, interrupting whatever he might have said next. But his hand did not move, did not release me as people passed by outside without looking in, unaware of the shift happening inside this small space. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, steadier, but somehow heavier. "Then do not let me decide it alone." And my heart skipped hard enough that I felt it in my throat, because that was not control, not exactly, not the kind I had been trying to fight. It was something else, something that pulled me in instead of pushing me away. And for a moment I did not move, did not step out of the elevator, because I realized I was no longer sure which direction was safer, walking away or following him. And the worst part was, I was starting to think I did not want to walk away at all. The hallway outside the private floor was quieter than anywhere else in the building, the kind of quiet that felt intentional, like even the air knew better than to linger too loudly. And I stepped out of the elevator slowly, aware of the way his hand remained at my wrist for 1 second longer than necessary, before finally releasing. But the absence of that contact did not make things easier. It made it worse, because now I could still feel it, like a phantom imprint that refused to fade. And I told myself to move, to put distance between us, to regain some kind of control over my thoughts. But my feet did not cooperate the way they should have. And by the time I reached the glass doors of his office, he was already there, holding them open without looking back, like he knew I would follow, like there was never a question about it. And that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, unsettling in a way I could not fully explain. And once inside, the door clicked shut behind us, sealing off the rest of the world in a way that felt far more final than the elevator ever had. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the city stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, distant and quiet, like it belonged to someone else entirely. And I stood near the edge of the room, unsure whether to step further in or stay exactly where I was, caught somewhere between leaving and staying. And then his voice broke the silence, calm, steady. "You are thinking too much," he said, like it was an observation, not a criticism. And I let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because, of course I was. How could I not be? You are not thinking enough. I replied before I could stop myself, and that got his attention in a way nothing else had. His gaze sharpening just slightly as he turned fully toward me, and the space between us felt heavier again, charged in a way that made it harder to breathe evenly. But I did not back down this time. I could not after everything he had said, everything he had implied without giving me anything solid to hold on to. You are making decisions that affect both of us without actually asking me what I want. I continued, my voice steadier now, anchored by the fact that I needed answers, real ones, not half statements that left everything open-ended. And for a second he did not respond, just watched me. And there was something different in that silence, something less controlled, less distant, like I had finally stepped into a part of this he could not completely manage. And then he moved, slow, deliberate, closing the distance between us again until the space felt too small, too aware, and his voice dropped just enough that it felt like it belonged only to this moment. Then tell me, he said, simple, direct, and it caught me off guard, because I expected resistance, expected control, not this, not an opening, not an invitation that put the focus back on me. And for a second I hesitated, because the truth was not simple. It was not clean or easy to explain. It was a mess of confusion and something else I was still trying to name, but I forced myself to speak anyway, because I owed myself that much. I want to understand what this is, I said, quieter now, but no less certain. I want to know if this is still just a strategy or if it is something real. And the words hung between us, heavier than anything else I had said so far. And he did not look away, did not deflect, just held my gaze like he was measuring something, like he was deciding how much truth to give me. And then his hand lifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, not reaching immediately, just hovering for a second before gently brushing against my sleeve. And the contact was light, almost careful, like he was aware of the line. He was stepping toward, and his voice followed, lower, steadier, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. If it were only strategy, he said, I would not have brought you here. And my breath caught, because that answer was not complete, not fully, but it was enough to shift something inside me, enough to make the line between what this was supposed to be and what it was becoming blur even further. And for the first time since all of this started, I realized something that made everything feel both clearer and more complicated at the same time. I was no longer just reacting to him. I was choosing to stay. You are choosing this. The thought came out of nowhere and hit harder than anything he had said, because it was mine, not his, and I felt it settle somewhere deep, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. And I looked at him, really looked this time, not just at the polished surface everyone else saw, not just the composed CEO who never hesitated, but at the small details that did not quite fit that image. The way his hand lingered a second longer than necessary before pulling back, the way his gaze stayed on me even when there was nothing left to say, like he was waiting, like he was giving me space but not distance, and it made my chest tighten in a way that felt too close to something I was not ready to name. So I broke the silence again before it swallowed me whole. You keep saying things like that, I said, quieter now, but more certain. But you still are not telling me everything. And for a second I expected him to deflect again, to redirect, to turn this back into something controlled and manageable. But he did not. He just watched me. And there was something different in it this time, something less guarded, like the wall he kept in place had shifted just enough to let something real through. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, but not distant, not anymore. What do you think I am not telling you? He asked. And that question felt heavier than it should have, because it forced me to say it out loud, to put shape to something I had been trying to keep vague, easier to dismiss that way. Why me? I said finally, and the words landed between us, simple but loaded, because that was the center of everything, the part that did not make sense no matter how I tried to frame it. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away this time, because I needed an answer that was not strategy, not convenience, something real enough to stand on. And for a moment he did not respond, not immediately, and that hesitation told me more than anything else could have, because he was not someone who paused without reason, not someone who needed time to construct a response. And yet here he was, considering, choosing his words carefully in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. And then he stepped closer again, slower than before, giving me time to react, to move if I wanted to, but I did not. I stayed exactly where I was, and that felt like its own kind of answer. And when he spoke, it was quieter than anything he had said so far, almost like it was meant for me alone. Because you did not look at me the way everyone else does, he said. And I blinked, thrown off balance by how simple it sounded, how unexpected. And he continued before I could interrupt. At the gala, before anything happened, you were watching the room. Not me, not the cameras, not the attention. You looked like you wanted to disappear. And my breath caught slightly, because he was not wrong, not even a little. And the memory flashed sharp and clear in my mind. The noise, the lights, the way I had felt completely out of place. And he held my gaze as he spoke, steady, unwavering. And you did not change after, he added. Not when I spoke to you. Not when I pulled you closer. You were still trying to understand, not trying to gain something from it. And something in my chest twisted at that, because I had not realized he noticed, had not realized he was paying attention long before the moment that changed everything. And I exhaled slowly, trying to process that, trying to fit it into the version of him I thought I understood, and failing. Because this version did not match the one everyone else saw. This one was paying attention, in ways that felt too personal, too intentional, and I shook my head slightly, not because I disagreed, but because it still did not feel like enough, not for what was happening now. That does not explain this, I said, gesturing lightly between us, the space that kept closing no matter how much I tried to define it. And for the first time there was a faint shift in his expression, something almost like frustration, not sharp, not overwhelming, but there, just beneath the surface, and it made something in me steady, because it meant this was not as easy for him as he made it seem. And his hand lifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, stopping just short of my wrist before settling lightly against it. Not gripping, not holding, just there, and his voice followed, low and certain. It explains why I did not let you walk away, he said, and my heart stuttered at that, because there was no ambiguity in it, no room to pretend this was still something distant or detached, and I swallowed, because the truth was, I had not tried very hard to walk away either. Not really. Not since the moment everything shifted, and that realization hit just as hard as anything else, because it meant this was no longer just about him. It was about me too, about the fact that I was still here, still standing in front of him, still listening, and for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped pretending I was only caught in this and admitted that I was stepping into it on my own. The moment he said it, that he had not let me walk away, something inside me shifted in a way I could not undo. Like a line I had been carefully pretending existed suddenly disappeared, and I stood there with his hand still resting lightly against my wrist, not holding, not forcing, but present, deliberate, and the space between us felt smaller again, tighter, like it was closing in without actually moving. And I realized I had stopped thinking about leaving, stopped planning an exit the way I usually did in situations that felt too overwhelming, too unpredictable. And that realization alone made my pulse spike, because it meant I was no longer reacting out of instinct. I was staying, because I wanted to understand, because part of me needed to see where this went, and that was dangerous in a way I could not fully explain. So I did the only thing I could to keep some control. I pulled my wrist back, not abruptly, just enough to break that quiet contact, and his fingers stilled for a fraction of a second before falling away. No resistance, no attempt to stop me, but his gaze did not shift. It stayed on me, steady, aware, like he had expected that reaction, like he was waiting to see what I would do next. And I took a small step back, just enough to create space, even though it did not feel like enough, not with the way his presence seemed to fill the room regardless of distance. You are making this hard to ignore, I said, my voice quieter now, more honest than I intended, because that was the truth. This was not something I could brush off anymore, not something I could pretend was just temporary. Just strategy, and his expression changed slightly at that. Not surprise, not exactly, but something closer to acknowledgement, like he understood what I meant without needing me to explain it further. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, not empty, not awkward, just full of something that had not been there before, something that made it harder to look away, harder to pretend this was still simple. And then he moved again, slower this time, not closing the distance completely, just enough to shift the balance back toward him, and his voice dropped, steady, controlled, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that felt less like a decision and more like a confession. That is because it is not meant to be ignored, he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because there was no ambiguity in them, no room to reinterpret or deflect, and I felt my breath catch slightly, because part of me had been hoping for an easy answer, something I could use to step back, to create distance again, but he was not giving me that, not anymore, and I shook my head slightly, not because I disagreed, but because I needed to say it out loud, needed to push back against the way this was pulling me in. You are asking me to step into something without telling me where it leads, I said, and my voice steadied as I spoke, grounded by the fact that this mattered, that I could not just let it happen without understanding the consequences. And his gaze did not waver, did not soften, but there was something different in it now, something more direct, more certain, like he had already made that decision for himself and was simply waiting to see if I would meet him there. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, but no less firm. I am asking you to decide if you want to find out, he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else could have, because it shifted the focus back to me, back to the choice I had been avoiding, and for a second I could not respond, because the truth was not simple, it was not clear, it was a mix of hesitation and curiosity, and something else that felt too close to anticipation, and I could feel it building, that tension, that pull, and I knew, standing there in that quiet office with the city stretched out below us, that whatever I said next would change something, not just for him, but for me too, and that realization settled deep, heavy and undeniable, because for the first time since all of this started, I was not just trying to understand what he wanted, I was starting to question what I wanted, and that was a far more dangerous question than anything else he could have asked. The question lingered in the air long after he said it, not loud, not forceful, just there, steady and impossible to ignore, and I felt it settle somewhere deep, heavier than anything else in this room, because it was no longer about him, not entirely. It was about me, about whether I was willing to step forward or walk away. And for the first time since all of this started, I realized I could not hide behind confusion anymore, could not pretend I was only being pulled into this, because he had made it clear, this was a choice, mine, and that realization made my chest tighten in a way that felt unfamiliar, not panic, not exactly, something sharper, something closer to anticipation, and I exhaled, slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to find something solid to stand on, but there was nothing simple about this, nothing predictable, and that was exactly what made it hard to walk away. So instead of answering him right away, I asked something else, something that had been building quietly beneath everything we had already said. What happens if I say yes? I said, my voice quieter now but steady, because if this was a choice, I needed to understand what I was stepping into, and his gaze shifted slightly at that, not surprised, but more focused, like this was the question he had been waiting for, and he did not answer immediately, which told me more than anything else could have, because he was choosing his words carefully, not out of hesitation, but intention, and then he stepped closer again, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make the space between us feel deliberate, like it mattered, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, calmer, but there was something beneath it, something that felt less controlled than before. Then we stopped pretending this is temporary, he said, and my breath caught, because that was not a small answer, not something easy to process or dismiss. It was a shift, a clear one, and I felt it settle somewhere deep, changing the shape of everything that had come before it, and I swallowed, because that meant there was no simple way out after that, no clean line to step back across. And he continued, watching me carefully, like he was, measuring every reaction, every hesitation. Then I stopped holding back, he added, and the words were quiet, but they landed heavier than anything else he had said, because I had not realized he was holding back at all. Not until that moment. Not until I thought about the way he always stopped just short of crossing a line. The way his touch never lingered too long. The way he gave me space even when he pulled me closer, and something in my chest tightened at that realization, because it meant this had always been more controlled than it felt, more restrained than I understood, and I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but because the weight of it was starting to build, too much all at once. And if I say no? I asked, because I needed to know that too. Needed to understand what walking away actually looked like now, after everything that had already happened, and for the first time, there was a pause in him that felt different, not uncertain, but heavier, like the answer was not as simple as the question, and his gaze held mine, steady, unwavering, but there was something deeper in it now, something that made it harder to breathe evenly. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain. "Then I let you go," he said, and the words should have felt like relief. They should have given me space, an easy exit, but they did not. Not the way he said them, not with the way his hand hovered again near my wrist without touching, like he was already preparing for that distance, already bracing for it, and something in my chest twisted unexpectedly, because the idea of that space, of walking away now, felt different than it had before, heavier, harder, like I was giving something up instead of escaping it. And I realized, standing there with the city stretched out behind him and the quiet of his office pressing in around us, that the question was no longer about what he wanted, or even what this was. It was about whether I was ready to step into something I could not fully control, something that might not have a clear ending. And for a moment I said nothing, because I could feel the answer forming, slow and steady, somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere that did not care about plans or consequences. And when I finally looked at him again, really looked, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. I was not afraid of him, not anymore. I was afraid of what choosing him might mean. The silence stretched just a second too long after that realization, heavy and fragile at the same time, like something was about to shift whether I was ready or not, and I could feel it building in my chest, that pressure, that awareness that whatever I said next would not just answer his question, it would define everything that came after. And for a moment I considered stepping back, choosing the safer path, the predictable one, the version of myself that kept things simple and controlled and distant. But that version felt farther away now than it ever had, like I had already stepped past it without noticing. And I exhaled slowly, steadying my voice before it could betray how much this actually mattered. "You said you would let me go," I said, not as a question, but as a reminder, something I needed to hear again, something I needed to hold on to if I was going to make this decision clearly. And his gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was something in it now that felt more exposed, more honest than before. "If that is what you choose," he replied, and the words were simple, but the way he said them made it clear that he already understood the weight of that choice, already knew what it would cost. And I nodded slowly, because that was fair, because he was giving me exactly what I had asked for: space, control, the ability to decide for myself. And yet it did not feel like freedom, not in the way I expected. It felt like standing on the edge of something I could not fully see, knowing that stepping back would be easier, safer, but also knowing that I would always wonder what was on the other side if I did not move forward. And I looked at him again, really looked, taking in the way he stood there without pressing, without reaching for me this time, his hands at his sides, his posture steady, composed, but there was something beneath that calm, something restrained, like he was holding himself back in a way I had not fully understood until now. And that realization hit differently, because it meant this was not just about what he wanted, it was about what he was choosing not to do, the lines he was deliberately not crossing. And I felt something shift again, something quieter but more certain, and before I could overthink it, before I could retreat back into doubt, I took a small step forward, closing the distance I had created earlier, not all the way, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional, chosen, and his attention sharpened immediately, not in surprise, but in recognition, like he understood what that movement meant before I even said anything, and my heart was still racing, still loud enough that I could feel it in my throat, but my voice, when I spoke, was steadier than I expected. "I am not saying yes yet," I said, because that mattered, because I needed him to understand that this was not blind, not impulsive, and his expression did not change, but something in his posture eased slightly, like he accepted that boundary without question, without resistance. And I continued, because I needed to finish this, needed to be clear, but I am not walking away either. And there it was, the truth, simple and complicated at the same time. And for a second, nothing happened. No immediate response, no dramatic shift, just a quiet moment where everything seemed to settle into place around that decision. And then he moved, slow and deliberate, closing the last bit of distance between us, not rushing, not overwhelming, just enough that I could feel his presence fully again. And his hand lifted, stopping just short of my wrist before resting. Lightly there, the same place as before, but this time the contact felt different, not a claim, not a test, just an acknowledgement, like we had both stepped into something together, and his voice followed, low and steady, carrying a weight that made my chest tighten in a way that felt less like fear and more like anticipation. "That is enough," he said, and I swallowed, because somehow that answer felt more significant than anything else he could have said, not because it was final, but because it was a beginning. And as I stood there, aware of the city beyond the glass, the quiet of the room, and the steady presence of him right in front of me, I realized that whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, it had already gone too far to pretend it was nothing, and the only question left now was how far I was willing to follow it. Something shifted the moment he said that it was enough, not in the room, not in the space between us, but in me, quiet and undeniable, like a decision had settled into place even if I had not fully named it yet. And I became acutely aware of everything at once. The faint hum of the city far below, the reflection of light against the glass, the warmth of his hand still resting lightly against my wrist, not gripping, not holding me in place, just there, steady, like a point I could either move toward or away from. And the strange part was, I did not want to pull back this time, not immediately, not instinctively. And that realization lingered, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and I exhaled slowly, letting the tension in my shoulders ease just a fraction, because for the first time since all of this started, I did not feel like I was bracing for something. I felt like I was standing inside it, aware and present in a way that made everything sharper, clearer, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out quieter, but steadier than before. "Then we need boundaries," I said, because even as I stepped forward, I needed something to anchor this, something to keep it from becoming overwhelming, unpredictable in a way I could not manage. And his gaze did not waver, did not challenge the statement. But there was a shift in it, subtle but real, like he was recalibrating, adjusting to this new version of the conversation where I was not just reacting, I was participating, and he nodded. "Once, slow, deliberate, then we define them," he said, and the simplicity of that response grounded something in me, because it meant this was not one-sided, not entirely. It meant he was willing to meet me in the middle instead of pulling me entirely into his world. And I let out a small breath I did not realize I had been holding, because that mattered more than I expected. "At work," I continued, choosing my words carefully, "we keep it professional, no public statements, no speaking for me, unless I ask you to." And for a second I watched him closely, waiting for resistance, waiting for that quiet dominance to push back. But it did not this time. And instead there was something else in his expression, something almost like approval, not because I was setting limits, but because I was clear about them. And he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without hesitation. "Agreed," he said, and that single word carried more weight than I expected, because it was not conditional, not dismissive. It was acceptance, straightforward and complete. And something in my chest eased at that, just a little, enough to make the next part easier to say. "Outside of work," I added, my voice dipping slightly, because this was the part that felt less certain, less defined. "We take this one step at a time." And there was a pause after that, not long, but enough to make the air feel different again, and his gaze held mine, steady and focused, like he was measuring the distance between where we were and where this could go. And then he stepped just slightly closer, not enough to break the space we had just defined, but enough to acknowledge it, to exist within it instead of overriding it. And his hand shifted, not tightening, not pulling me in, just adjusting, a small movement that felt intentional, controlled, and his voice followed, lower now, but calm, certain. "One step at a time," he repeated. And there was something in the way he said it that made it feel less like a limitation and more like a promise, something that would not be rushed, something that would not be forced. And I felt my breath steady at that, because it was exactly what I needed without realizing it. And for a moment neither of us moved, the space between us quiet, but no longer uncertain, no longer undefined. And then his gaze shifted briefly to my hand, still near his, still within reach, before returning to my eyes. And there was something softer there now, not weaker, not less controlled, just clearer. And he said, quieter this time, like the words were meant only for me. Then the first step is simple. And my heart skipped, just once, because there was something in his tone that felt different, something more personal than anything he had said before. And I found myself asking before I could stop it, what is that? And he held my gaze, steady, unwavering, before answering. You stopped thinking about leaving. And the words landed softly, but the meaning behind them settled deep, because for the first time, I realized I already had. The words settled between us in a way that felt quieter than everything else, but somehow more permanent, like they did not need to be repeated to be understood, and I realized with a strange, almost disorienting clarity that he was right. I had already stopped thinking about leaving somewhere along the way, not consciously, not as a deliberate decision, but gradually, step by step, until the idea of walking away felt less like relief and more like loss, and that realization made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because it meant this was no longer just curiosity or confusion. It was something deeper, something that had taken root before I noticed it, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the shift in my thoughts, but there was no denying it anymore, not when I was still standing here, not when I had already chosen to stay. And for a moment I said nothing, just looked at him, really looked, taking in the way he held himself, controlled and composed as always, but there was something different now, something more open, not obvious, not something anyone else would notice, but I did, and that alone made everything feel more real, more grounded, and when I finally spoke, my voice was quieter, but more certain than before. I already did, I said, and the words felt strange at first, unfamiliar in their honesty, but once they were out, they settled into place in a way that felt right, like they belonged there, and his gaze shifted slightly at that, not surprised, not exactly, but more focused, like he was adjusting to this new version of me. This version that was not stepping back, not hesitating in the same way. And there was a small pause, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something that neither of us seemed willing to break just yet. And then he moved, not closing the distance this time, not reaching for me immediately, just enough to shift the balance again. Subtle but deliberate, and his voice followed, low and steady. Then we moved forward, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a clear direction, and I felt my pulse pick up again, not from fear, not the kind that had been there before, but from something else, something sharper, something that felt closer to anticipation, because moving forward meant something now. It was no longer abstract, no longer undefined. It was a choice we were both making, and I nodded slowly. Because I understood that, because I had already agreed to it in a way that mattered more than words, and the moment stretched just long enough for that decision to settle before anything else happened. And then his hand lifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, like he was aware of every movement, every inch of space between us, and when his fingers brushed lightly against my wrist again, the contact felt different, not tentative, not uncertain, just steady, like it belonged there, and I did not pull away, not this time. And that alone shifted something between us, something subtle but undeniable, and his gaze dropped briefly to where our hands met before returning to my eyes. And there was something in it now that had not been there before, something less restrained, less distant, and his voice lowered slightly, carrying a weight that made my breath catch without warning. Then you stay close, he said, and the words echoed the first thing he had told me, but they felt different now, not like an order, not like a necessity, but like something we both understood, something we had chosen, and I swallowed, because the meaning behind it settled deep, because staying close was no longer just physical, it was something else entirely, something that extended beyond this room, beyond this moment, and I felt it in the way my thoughts aligned with that idea without resistance, in the way I did not question it the same way I would have before, and I realized, standing there with his hand resting lightly against mine and the city stretching out endlessly behind him, that this was no longer something I was trying to define. It was something I was beginning to feel, something I was stepping into without fully knowing where it would lead. And for the first time, that uncertainty did not push me away. It pulled me closer. The words "stay close" lingered longer than they should have, not just in the room, but somewhere deeper, settling into a space I had not realized was waiting for them. And I felt it in the way my thoughts slowed instead of spiraling, in the way I did not immediately search for an exit or a reason to step back. Because for the first time, staying did not feel like a risk I was being pushed into. It felt like something I was choosing with clear awareness, and that awareness made everything sharper, more defined. The quiet of the office, the distant movement of traffic far below, the subtle shift of his hand still resting against mine, not tightening, not pulling, just present. And I realized that was the difference now. Nothing he was doing felt forced anymore. It felt intentional, measured, like he was matching my pace instead of setting it. And that realization eased something in my chest I had not even noticed was tense. And I let out a slow breath, steady, grounding, because this was no longer overwhelming in the same way. It was something I could stand inside without losing my balance. And when I looked at him again, I saw it more clearly. The way his focus remained on me without wavering, not demanding, not expecting, just there, waiting. And it struck me then that he had not moved past the boundary I set. Not once. Even now. Even with the shift between us. And that mattered more than anything else. Because it meant I was not being pulled forward without control. I was being met exactly where I stood. And the thoughts settled quietly, giving me something solid to hold on to. And I spoke again before the silence could stretch too far. This does not change everything overnight, I said, not as a warning, but as a reminder, something that needed to be clear. And his expression did not shift into resistance or impatience. It remained steady, attentive, like he understood that already. And he nodded once, slow and certain. "It does not have to," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer grounded me further because it removed the pressure I had not fully acknowledged, the expectation that this had to become something defined immediately, something complete, and instead it left space, room to move forward without losing control of the pace. And I felt my shoulders relax just slightly at that, because it meant I could stay without being overwhelmed. And for a moment neither of us moved. The space between us quiet, but no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, just steady. And then his hand shifted slightly, not tightening, not pulling, just adjusting so that his fingers brushed more fully against mine. A small movement that felt deliberate, but careful, like he was testing the line without crossing it. And I did not pull away, not this time. Not when the contact felt different, softer, more grounded in something mutual rather than one-sided. And I realized that was the shift, the difference between where we started and where we were now. This was no longer about him deciding and me reacting. It was something we were both stepping into, something shared. And that thought settled deeper than anything else, because it made this real in a way I could not dismiss. And I swallowed, aware of how much quieter my thoughts had become, how much clearer everything felt now that I was not fighting it. And I found myself saying something I had not planned, something that felt more instinctive than anything else. "Then we keep it honest," I said, because that was the only way this would work, the only way I could stay without losing myself in something I did not understand. And his gaze sharpened slightly at that, not in disagreement, but in recognition, like he understood exactly what I meant. And he nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate. "Always," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no ambiguity, just certainty. And it settled something in me that I had not realized was still uncertain. Because honesty meant clarity, meant I would not be left trying to read between lines. That kept shifting, and I felt it then, the balance settling into place, not perfect, not complete, but stable enough to stand on. And for a moment the world outside the glass felt distant, irrelevant, compared to the quiet understanding forming in this room. And I realized something that felt both simple and significant at the same time. This was not about where it would lead anymore, not entirely. It was about the fact that I was no longer trying to escape it, and that alone changed everything. The word "always" did not echo the way everything else had. It settled, quiet and steady, like something that did not need to be questioned to be understood, and I felt it in the way my thoughts did not resist it, did not try to dissect or pull it apart, because it made sense in a way everything else had been trying to reach. And for the first time since this all started, I realized I was not waiting for something to go wrong. I was not bracing for the moment it would fall apart or reveal itself. as something temporary. I was simply there, standing in the space we had built step by step, and it felt stable in a way I had not expected, not because it was defined, not because it had clear edges, but because it was real, and that realization settled deep, steadying something inside me that had been shifting since the moment he pulled me into that first unexpected contact. And I let out a slow breath. Not tense this time, not uncertain, just aware, and when I looked at him again, I saw it. Reflected back, that same awareness, that same understanding that something had changed in a way neither of us was pretending not to see. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, just full of everything we had not needed to say out loud. And then he moved, not closer, not breaking the space we had carefully set, just enough to shift his stance so that he was fully facing me, fully present in a way that felt deliberate, and his hand remained where it was, lightly against mine, not claiming, not testing, just there. And I realized that was the difference now. Nothing about this felt like a question anymore. It felt like a continuation, something already in motion, and that realization made something in my chest settle in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time. And I spoke again, not because I needed to fill the silence, but because there was one more thing that needed to be clear, one last piece that would define what came next. This stays between us for now, I said, my voice steady, grounded in the understanding we had already built, because even as this became real, it did not belong to anyone else yet, not to the company, not to the people who watched and speculated and filled in the gaps with their own assumptions. This was ours, and I needed to protect that, at least for now. And his gaze did not waver, did not challenge the statement, but there was a subtle shift in it, something like agreement layered with understanding, and he nodded once, slow and certain. Until you decide otherwise, he said. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not control, not something he would dictate. It was something that would follow my lead. And that mattered more than anything else, because it meant I was not losing myself in this. I was stepping into it with him, and the balance we had been building held steady. And for a moment the world outside the glass felt distant again, like it belonged to another version of my life that I was no longer standing in. And I realized that this, right here, was the beginning of something that did not need to be rushed or forced to be meaningful. It already was, in the quiet understanding, in the choices we had both made without pressure, and I felt it settle fully then, that shift from uncertainty into something more grounded, more intentional, and I exhaled slowly, letting that realization take its place without resistance. And when I looked at him again, there was no hesitation left in the way I held his gaze, no question in the way I stood there. And he saw it. I knew he did, because something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to reflect that same certainty back at me. And his voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, but carried a weight that felt different from everything before, something more final in its meaning, even if it was only the beginning. Then we moved forward, he said, and I did not hesitate this time, did not question or pull back or try to redefine what that meant, because I already understood, and I nodded, once, steady, certain, and in that moment, with the city stretched out endlessly behind him and the quiet of his office surrounding us, I realized that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something I was trying to understand from a distance. It was something I had chosen to be part of, something I was stepping into fully. And as his hand remained lightly against mine, not tightening, not pulling, just there, I understood something else just as clearly. This was only the beginning, and neither of us was going to pretend otherwise.